Hello, my name is Paul Carroll. I currently run a nonprofit that advocates on behalf of humanitarian and peace building organizations. But for the vast majority of the last 25 years, I have worked in the philanthropic field, supporting organizations that work on nuclear security and specifically that work on nonproliferation and nuclear disarmament. Well, I would list it as a couple. My area of expertise has to do predominantly with U.S. nuclear weapons programs, budgets, strategy, and also the intersection between citizen participation and policy around nuclear weapons. A second aspect of that is specifically on the waste legacy of nuclear weapons production, testing, communities impacted by waste and contamination, and programs and budgets to address that. I think I would start with sort of nuclear weapons 101 and particularly a historical perspective of it, because one of the aspects of not just the United States, but nearly every nation that has a nuclear weapons program has been the utter secrecy around these programs, which to me is anathema to democracy and citizen participation. And so I have done talks like that where I sort of paint the picture of the origins of nuclear weapons and the fact that most communities have lived beside them without ever knowing it until very, very recently. I think that's a really important thing, and for many people, sort of an aha moment. I really came of age in the late 1980s, and at that point in time, nuclear weapons and the specter of their destructiveness was everyday news. It was, I wouldn't even call it the height of the Cold War, but it was pretty near the height of the Cold War, where you had a US President, Reagan, and a more progressive premier in Russia, in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev. But the rhetorical use of nuclear weapons was common, and there was an awareness that these things could end us all. And so to not be aware of that, and I was a political science and history student, so it was hard to avoid. But at the same time, I had learned to fly when I was in high school. I wanted to go into the Air Force and fly jets because they were the coolest, and why not, and serve my country. And then I realized there was a different facet where I could contribute as a public policy practitioner, as someone who could, sort of educate people about how their voices could be heard, to pull the veil off of the secrecy of nuclear weapons and to engage like any other issue, whether it was education or homelessness or what have you. And once you sort of get your foot in the door, it's hard to pull it back out. So over the course of those years, initially I worked in the government in Washington, D.C. I worked in Congress, and then I worked in the Department of Energy on the cleanup program, which was a fascinating education in a very short order. And then I was very fortunate to work, as I said, at a foundation that made grants to a wide array of organizations, from think tanks to academic institutions to very effective and assertive grassroots activists. And that was, I was so privileged to do so, because it really gave me a 30,000-foot view of the whole ecosystem around this topic. As an undergraduate, I was a political science and history major, and I started to key in on sort of 20th century US foreign policy, the Cold War, nuclear strategy. I was at Rutgers University. I found professors that were expert and engaged on those kinds of issues. And then at the time, I had my professor said, if you're really serious about engaging in this or being part of the Washington ecosystem, you really should consider graduate school. Because I remember one of my professors said, bachelor's degrees are a dime a dozen. You really should go the next level. And at the time, around 1990, there was a new sort of ecosystem of public policy schools growing up. There had been some already. The Fletcher School was well known and so on, but more and more schools were developing. And I went to the University of Maryland and the School of Public Affairs, and they specifically had a national security studies focus. And so I was drawn to that. And not only that, it was adjacent to Washington, D.C. So it was a really great sort of, marriage of an academic career and having availability of internships or colleagues in Washington. And so almost immediately after finishing at the University of Maryland with a master's of public policy, I found a role in a congressional research agency that actually had been tasked with studying how to get rid of nuclear materials from dismantled nuclear weapons. So that, again, that was sort of like lightning striking. I just was in the right place at the right time, so to speak. But that then led to, as life and professional careers often do, that, who you know, the people you're engaged with. But politics matter too. So in 1992, the Clinton administration was elected, came into office, and there was a movement to declassify a lot of information around nuclear weapons. The Cold War had ended. Suddenly, there was a sort of a renaissance of, let's really look at what we've been doing these last 50 years and the communities that have been impacted. And so I worked in the Department of Energy from about 1992 to 1995. As I said, on the cleanup program. It's called the Environmental Management Program. And we published reports and books that explained where all these facilities were and what they did and how they worked and what the challenges were. And so shortly after that, again, as many careers often do, they mix in with your personal life. And I moved to the West Coast and had no clue what I was going to do other than what I cared about. And I started looking for organizations or roles that were in some way connected to foreign policy or security policy, and found my way to the Plowshares Fund, which has been a long time and I think very innovative and bold funder in nuclear security. And it's a public foundation, so they raise the money that they use to make grants. And I was, again, sort of in the right place at the right time. When I joined, there were 5 staff, and the grant making budget was barely $1 million, I think. And over the arc of the next decade or so, we became a bi-coastal office. We grew to a staff of almost 20. I was basically the director of grant making. We had a staff of 3 just doing grant making, and we gave away about $7.5 million a year. And yeah, I was there for 17 years because I grew as the organization grew. It was exciting. But one thing I will note is that I didn't consider myself working in the philanthropic sector. The first 5 or 6 years, I was like, no, this is a great job to work on nuclear weapons issues, which is what I care about. And then about 5 or 6 years in, a colleague of mine said, well, if you plan to stay in this sector, the philanthropic sector, and I sort of woke up and realized, oh, right, I'm not that I'm a philanthropist, but I'm in the philanthropic sector. So I realized there was a really, there are ways to blend your passions and your skill sets, and not necessarily put yourself in a box of, oh, I'm an academic or I'm a technical expert, so I have to work in this kind of a place. I think particularly in the last 10 years, there's been a much greater opportunity to blend roles and skills, and also zip codes, frankly, and time zones. It doesn't have to be a Washington, D.C. centered arena anymore. How Zoom and the pandemic, the sort of unintended consequences are, we can communicate virtually instantaneously around the globe. And so in some ways it brings us together. I think in other ways there's a greater insularity between people, particularly people with economic means, that can be in a bubble. I mean, I live in an area of the country, the San Francisco Bay Area, that's very affluent, and you see Ukrainian flags and sunflowers all over the place, but I wonder how many people have been to that area or have actually felt or know someone who's been impacted by the war. It's easy enough to symbolize support or camaraderie, but it's a very different thing to understand the reality of the situation. And I think with the nuclear context, with Russia and Ukraine and so on, it does concern me because there's a lot of things, but let me simplify by saying, as the broader trends of the number of weapons has come down, I think people inaccurately think, well, therefore the risk is lower. Or if a nuclear weapon is used simply in the theater context in Ukraine, that's over there. It won't, affect us. And I think that's a huge mistake. I happen to believe that it's really important to keep a very bright line that any nuclear use anywhere whether it's theater or tactical, I think those words are actually meaningless. Um, a fission is a fission, and a nuclear explosion is a nuclear explosion, and we need to keep that bar very, very high.